Intervals are the building blocks of music. They are a way of measuring and communicating the distance and relationship between pitches, whether they are stacked into a chord or laid out into a scale. For example, the interval distance between A and E is larger than A and C. Using this A and E interval as an example, it could be expressed horizontally, playing the notes one after the other, which is the basis of melody, or it could be expressed vertically, playing the notes together, which is the basis of harmony. Same interval, same musical distance, different application. Now, while the musical alphabet names each note with a letter, intervals are represented by numbers, each one representing a specific distance between two pitches. So the function of notes and intervals is slightly different. While notes tell us the absolute position of a pitch on our instrument, intervals are relative to a reference or starting pitch. For example, this interval or musical distance is the same no matter where it's positioned. So while A and E, for example, are two individual notes with their own names, together they represent a single interval that can be positioned at different pitches. C to G, D to A, and E to B are the same interval as A to E, because they all represent the same distance and therefore musical relationship. Incidentally, this specific interval has a name, a perfect fifth, but we'll look more at naming intervals later. Musicians often refer to the skill of being able to identify these relationships, no matter which reference note they start on, as relative pitch recognition. Such a musician would hear the movement from E to B as the same as A to E, even though different notes are being played. It's the relationship between the notes that determines their musical quality. So interval recognition is a powerful skill to master because it means you don't have to know every note being played. Instead, you see or hear a movement or relationship between notes and can then recreate that relationship in any place on the neck. Visually, this ability to move relationships of notes to different places is what creates familiar shapes and patterns. Shapes for chords, patterns for scales. For example, this scale pattern has the same interval structure whether we start it on G, A, C, D, or any starting note. Similarly, this chord shape has the same interval structure whether we position it on B, D, E, or G. With enough practice, you'll hear the shape on B as the same as the shape on E, even though the second one is collectively higher in pitch. In other words, both positions share the same musical quality. Back to our scale pattern. Contained within it are several pitches and therefore several intervals in relation to a starting or reference pitch, sometimes called the root or one. Using the first instance of the root, here's one interval, here's another, and another, right up to the root octave. Let's take just one interval from that pattern between its first and third tone, more accurately called the first and third degrees of the scale. By training your eyes and ears to identify this relationship, we can target that same interval in any position or key, first to third. Notice how we didn't even need to think about which alphabetical note we were moving to in each position. We just use the familiarity of the visual and aural relationship of the interval to recreate it in a new position. Extend this concept to entire patterns or shapes, and you should be able to see the benefit that intervals give us in forming familiar movable relationships across the neck, no matter which key we may be playing in. While many musicians identify intervals based purely on sight and sound, most find it useful to also label these intervals using numbers. This also helps to communicate what's going on with other musicians. You'll see these numbers being used in most of the diagrams in my lessons, so let's find out where they come from. Going back to our scale pattern, we can label its first degree as 1, the root and therefore reference for all the other intervals in the scale. Moving to the second degree, we can label this 2, also called a major second interval. Why major? We'll find out soon enough. To the third degree, we can label this 3, also called a major third interval. Fourth degree, 4, also known as a perfect fourth. Don't worry about what the perfect means at this stage. These names have been around for many years. Fifth degree, 5 or a perfect fifth. Sixth degree, 6 or a major sixth. And seventh degree, 7 or major seventh. We now arrive at the octave of the root, the same note and scale degree as the 1. Some musicians prefer to label the octave as 8, but I think it's less confusing to just use 1 at each occurrence of the root. So, 7 degrees in total, and therefore 7 intervals in relation to the root, which is A in this particular position. Incidentally, this scale has a name. It's most commonly known as the major scale. Since the 1 is on A, we call it the A major scale. So the root determines which letter we use in the scale name. If the root was on C, for example, and we used the same interval structure, we'd have the C major scale. Therefore, it's the interval structure that determines the name we give to the scale. Now, those who are just starting out with all this might confuse degree numbers with interval numbers. For example, if we take out the 4th and 7th, we now only have 5 degrees, also known as a pentatonic scale. But we still use the same interval numbers on those remaining degrees, 2, 3, 5, and 6, because these represent specific positions or distances in relation to the root. Just saying a scale has 5 degrees doesn't tell us much about its musical structure. But if we say it has a 2, 3, 5, and 6, that tells us something very specific about its structure. It tells us the position of each degree in the scale in relation to the 1. Let's go back to our 7-tone major scale. What would happen if we moved the second degree down by 1 fret or semitone? Now the scale has a flat second, also called a minor second. So we had a major second interval before, and now we've lowered it to a minor second interval. This is the smallest interval that exists on a regular fretted guitar. So there's just 1 fret between the 1 and minor second. Even though we've only changed 1 interval, it gives the scale quite a different sound, along with a unique name. However you describe that sound, it's useful to know what creates it. With enough practice, you'll be able to hear the minor second's presence in a melodic sequence, but that comes with exploring scales individually. Let's put the 2 back in its original position. You could call this its natural position, since it's not sharp or flat. What if we moved the 3rd in the same way? Predictably, we get a flat 3rd, also called a minor 3rd, a key interval in minor chords and scales. Like the minor 2nd, the minor 3rd gives the scale a specific quality when played with the other intervals. We've now turned our major scale into a minor scale, and all because of one small interval change on the 3rd degree. We could, if we wanted, play the minor 3rd on the 6th string instead, since it represents the same note and distance from the 1. Back to major. Let's now move the 4th degree. We can't move it down because the 3rd is there, so let's move it up instead. Now we have a sharp 4th, also called an augmented 4th. Why augmented? Another historically used term for the sharp 4th that you can read about if you're interested. Just remember that augment in music is interval speak for sharp. Like the other interval changes we made, this augmented 4th creates a new scale with a unique sound. As we go through these changes, you can pick out certain visual relationships between the interval positions. For example, the sharp 4th is 1 fret or semitone down from the 5th. This is the case no matter where the scale is played. In other words, these relationships are movable. We don't even need to know the note it's positioned on. Intervals are about relative positions. Back to the original position. Let's now move the 5th. Now, here's where things get a little confusing. We can potentially have a flat 5 or a sharp 5. A flat 5, also known as a diminished 5th, occupies the same position as an augmented 4th. So how do we know whether to call it a 5th or a 4th? Well, if there's already a 4 in the scale, we use a flat 5. You'll see the flat 5 used in scales such as this one, along with a minor 2nd and minor 3rd. As there's a 4 in this scale, we use a diminished 5th instead of an augmented 4th. When 2 intervals share the same pitch like this, such as the augmented 4th and diminished 5th, they are known as enharmonic. It's the presence of other intervals that determines which one we use. Wherever possible, a 7-degree scale should be numbered from 1 to 7, with the appropriate flats and sharps indicated where necessary. We could also raise the 5th, giving us a sharp 5, also known as an augmented 5th. But based on the numbering rule we just established, if there's already a 5 in the scale, the sharp 5 position becomes a flat 6, or minor 6th. For example, you'll hear the minor 6th being used in scales such as Harmonic Minor. Finally, the 7th degree, which can either be a major 7th, simply numbered 7, or a minor 7th when in its flat position. The minor 7th shows up in several minor scales and major scales like Mixolydian, which is simply the major scale with a flat 7. One visual cue for identifying the major seventh is 1 fret down from the root. Therefore, we could also position a major seventh on the 6th string as shown. A minor seventh is always 2 frets down from the root. It's the different combinations of these intervals, whether natural, flat or sharp, that gives us the different scale qualities we need to play over compatible chords and progressions. For example, if the chord we're playing over is minor, we'll know that a minor third interval will be part of the scale. If the chord has a minor seventh, we'll want to ensure our scale matches that. But more importantly, intervals specify the pitch of each scale degree, no matter where the root of that scale is positioned on the neck. So while an A minor scale uses different notes to a D minor scale, the only notes we really need to be aware of are the roots, since the interval structure of the scale is the same for both. Whether the minor scale starts on A, B, C, D, E, etc., its interval structure is still 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7. The relative distance between each pitch in the scale is the same on any root. Eventually, you'll be able to work out how a scale would be formed on the neck simply by its numbering formula. For example, 1, flat 2, 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7 gives us this scale, known as Phrygian Dominant. A Phrygian Dominant, B Phrygian Dominant, D Phrygian Dominant. Chords use a similar interval formula to create their unique qualities, but the numbering system we use is slightly different, and the cause of a lot of confusion when it comes to naming chords. We'll look specifically at chords in another part. In the meantime, visit the lesson page for more on getting to grips with intervals. Cheers.